The dust came in like shame, fine and clinging, turning the world the color of regret. By mid-morning, it had swallowed the road, the chapel steeple, and even the hills that usually stood proud behind the town of Dry Creek. The people still gathered, squinting through grit, hands shielding their faces, boots crunching over cracked earth. There was talk of rain, always talk, but the sky stayed hard and white as old bone. Ellie stood on the auction crate, barefoot and silent, as if the dust had crawled down her throat and stolen her voice. A ragged cotton dress hung off her shoulders, sun-bleached and too thin for the desert wind. Her hair was tangled, her skin marked by old bruises and dirt that no one had bothered to wash away. She didn't look at the crowd. She stared at her feet, as if shamed by their stillness. Strong back, barked Hank Dawson, swaying on his heels with a bottle in one hand and a rope in the other. Can cook and clean. She just don't hear. That ain't her fault, that's the Lord's design. Hell, it's like buying a mule that don't spook at thunder. A ripple of laughter rolled through the square, cruel, hollow. The kind of sound that turned decent folk into something less. Sheriff Raleigh leaned against a post near the saloon, not far enough to miss the ugliness, but far enough to say later he hadn't seen. Widow Marla Griggs clutched her basket to her chest like it held something sacred, eyes flicking from the girl to the crowd like she was watching a fire spread. No takers. Hank grinned, his teeth stained brown. Don't be shy now. She's healthy. Pretty too, once you get the dust off. Ellie flinched just slightly at the word pretty, a word that meant danger when spoken by men with no patience and too much drink. That's when he came, on foot, slow as a shadow at sundown. Tahoma didn't speak. He never did in crowds. His presence arrived before he did, the shape of him against the shimmering heat, the long dark hair tied with leather, the blanket roll slung over his shoulder, the long knife at his hip. Dusty the mule followed behind, plodding, ears twitching with each gust. The crowd shifted uncomfortable. Apache blood unsettled the settlers even now, even with the wars long past. Tahoma didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he just didn't care. He looked at Hank, then at the girl. His eyes were dark and still, like a well at midnight. Hank straightened. You want her, Injun. The word fell like spit in dry sand. Tahoma didn't answer. He reached into a small pouch tied at his belt and pulled out 5 silver coins. He laid them one by one on the crate's edge. Then a turquoise bead, polished, worn, shaped by time. Hank blinked. That'll do. He shoved a rope into Tahoma's hand and stumbled back, laughing to himself. Ellie didn't move. Her hands trembled, but her eyes remained fixed on the dirt, as if afraid to meet the gaze of her new owner. Tahoma didn't pull the rope. He didn't lead her like cattle. Instead, he untied it with quiet fingers and let it fall. Ellie blinked, startled. He reached into his coat and offered her a tin cup of water. She hesitated, then took it with both hands, tilting it carefully to her lips. The water wasn't cold, but it tasted like mercy. When they walked, it was side by side. The crowd watched them go, not knowing what to make of the image. An Apache warrior and a deaf girl bought for silver and silence, vanishing into the dust like ghosts in a fable. They walked beyond town, past the shuttered schoolhouse, the leaning chapel, the cracked corral gates. Ellie kept glancing at him, not with fear, though that was still there, but with a careful kind of curiosity, like a wounded bird watching a hand that hadn't yet struck. He didn't speak. When the wind picked up, she stopped and turned her head toward it, as if listening. Tahoma noticed. Her eyes were closed. Her hand touched the ground. Not hearing, but sensing. He watched her fingertips press into the dirt, reading the world like a secret. He led her to a camp a mile past the last fence line. A tent made of canvas and hide stood beneath a crooked juniper tree. A fire pit circled with stones. A water barrel. A few hanging bundles of dried meat and maize. Simple. Clean. Lived in. Ellie stood at the edge and waited. Tahoma motioned toward the small bedroll near the tent. She stepped forward, then paused. A dust devil rose nearby, spinning briefly, tossing grit and dead leaves into the air. She watched it like it might speak. He knelt beside the fire pit, began placing sticks for the evening meal. She slowly lowered herself to a rock near the tree. Neither of them spoke. When the fire sparked, she startled. He didn't apologize. He simply picked up the pot, filled it, and set it to boil. Ellie leaned forward slightly, watching his hands. They were steady, scarred, the hands of someone who had taken life and given it back. As the sun dipped behind the red hills, casting the desert in gold and rust, Tahoma turned to her and, for the first time, said her name, softly, carefully. Eliza. She looked up, not startled, but she heard something, not the word, but the way it fell into the air between them. He nodded. Tahoma. She nodded back, mouth barely moving. Her lips tried the shape of his name in silence. Later, she lay on the bedroll, staring up at the worn canvas overhead. The wind tugged at the tent walls, whispering in a tongue only the desert knew. Tahoma sat outside by the fire, watching the stars come on one by one. He didn't know yet what she'd been through. Didn't know her favorite color, or how she came to understand the rhythm of storms in her bones. But he'd seen something in her, something the town had missed. Not weakness, not silence, something wild, something not yet broken. Inside the tent, Ellie curled into herself. Her fingers traced slow circles in the blanket beneath her. Not words, just motion, just feeling. And as the fire popped and wind howled and all of Dry Creek shut its doors and said its prayers, the deaf girl who had no home lay under a canvas sky, with a name softly spoken, and a man who hadn't led her only walked beside. And that in her world was the beginning of everything. The mornings were cold in the desert, colder than a body expected after days of blistering heat. Ellie woke with her hands tucked beneath her chin, blanket tangled around her legs. The canvas above her was pale with dawnlight, rustling as the wind searched for a way in. Outside, she heard nothing, but the light shifted in a way that told her someone was already moving. She stepped out barefoot into the pink hush of daybreak. The fire had been lit. A pan of maize cakes was nestled in the coals, and Tahoma crouched beside it, carving a notch into a strip of wood. He looked up when he heard her feet on the earth, but didn't speak. Just gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that she'd survived the night. She returned it, timid but deliberate. The scent of roasted maize filled the air, mingled with wood smoke and juniper. It made her stomach tighten with hunger and a strange sort of hope she wasn't ready to name. He handed her a flat cake wrapped in cloth. Warmth passed between them, not just from the food but from the offering itself, simple, deliberate, kind. She sat on a stone and ate slowly, eyes on the horizon. When a hawk passed overhead, its shadow slid across the camp like a breath. She turned her head toward it. Tahoma noticed again how she sensed things others didn't. The way her shoulders shifted with the rhythm of wind, or how she paused when the ground seemed to hum. Not hearing, but not unknowing. She didn't ask questions. She never had, not even when her father sold her like a sack of grain. Questions in her world led to pain or silence. But she watched everything. That was how she learned. Later that morning, Tahoma handed her a bundle of kindling and pointed to the fire pit. She nodded, took it, and set the sticks with careful hands. He showed her how to shape the pile, where to leave space for breath. She mimicked him, brow furrowed with concentration. When the fire caught, she flinched only slightly this time. He gave her no praise, just let her feel the success settle in her bones. The days stretched long and dry. They did not speak, because words were not needed, not between them, not yet. He gave her tasks. She completed them, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with grace. She swept the ground with a juniper branch. She ground corn between two stones. She fetched water from the barrel, her thin arms trembling but determined. Each evening, Tahoma cooked, and she carved little shapes from twigs, animals' feathers, once a star. Her hands moved quickly, not with mastery, but with yearning. When she finished a small bird, she set it beside the fire between them. Tahoma studied it, then took his knife and began to shape a second bird, matching hers. When he handed it to her, she looked at him longer than before. Not with fear, with something softer. He didn't smile, but his eyes warmed. One afternoon, as the heat pressed down like a hand, he drew a symbol in the dirt between them for lines around a central mark. She tilted her head. He pointed to the sky, then to the fire, then back to the symbol. She frowned, then knelt and drew a curved shape beneath it, a crescent moon, hesitant but clear. His mouth moved. "Moon," he said, low and slow. She touched her lips, then pointed to his throat. She didn't speak, but he understood. She wasn't asking what the word meant. She was asking how it felt to say it. He pressed his hand to his chest and repeated, "Moon." She smiled faintly, a flicker only, and drew another symbol, a crooked heart, then placed her palm beside it. A question, quiet and searching. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a smooth stone and placed it beside her hand. Then another, Then one more. 3 stones. He didn't say anything, but she read it plainly. Some things take time to build. That night, the desert wind turned restless. It curled through the camp, shaking branches, lifting the edge of the tent. Ellie lay awake, one hand pressed against the earth. There were no sounds to warn her, but she felt the storm before it arrived. The sky flashed distant and blue-white. A dry lightning storm. She rose quietly and stepped outside. Tahoma was already standing there, wrapped in his blanket, watching the dark horizon. She moved beside him. The wind lifted her hair, tangled it across her face. She didn't bother brushing it away. He looked at her, not startled, not curious, just present. She reached for his arm and laid her palm gently against it, just below the shoulder. The skin there was warm and still. No words, no gesture to explain, but she needed to feel something steady. He let her. The wind howled once, like a coyote mourning the stars. And they stood there, 2 figures carved from shadow, each listening in their own way. In town, the gossip had already started. Marla Griggs whispered over her shop counter that Tahoma had taken a broken girl into his tent. Father Hale lowered his eyes and changed the subject. Sheriff Raleigh made a vague remark about boundaries and decency. Ellie didn't hear any of it, but she felt it. The next day, when she went with Tahoma to the edge of town to trade maize for salt, she saw the stares. Women turned their backs. Children pointed and giggled. One man spat in the dirt near her feet. She didn't look away. She didn't run. But that night, back in the camp, she carved a new figure, not a bird or animal, but a tree with broken branches. She set it in the sand beside the fire. Tahoma studied it a long time. Then he reached into the coals and pulled out a stick, still glowing at one end. With care, he burned a new branch into the tree she'd made, one stretching upward toward nothing in particular. He handed it back. Her fingers closed around it. For the first time, she smiled fully, like sun breaking through after endless dry. The next morning, she rose early and found the fire already warm. A tin pot of beans simmered low. Tahoma handed her a flatbread wrapped in cloth, then pointed to a nearby stump. She sat. He sat opposite her. Between them, he began to hum a low, deep rhythm, like a drum buried in the chest. A sound not meant for ears, but for skin and heart. She looked confused. So he reached across the space and took her hand, hesitantly, like a man unsure of permission, and placed it gently against his chest. She went still. Then slowly her eyes widened. She could feel the hum, not as sound but as vibration, as life, as something alive. He stopped. She left her hand there, and the fire crackled between them. Later that day, while sweeping the camp's edge, she paused. Something was blooming along the rocks, tiny desert flowers, pale purple, fragile and brave. She knelt beside them, fingers hovering over their soft petals, and smiled again. The girl who'd never been given a choice was beginning to choose. The heat came in heavy by mid-morning, pressing down like a punishment. Dry creek shimmered at its edges, buildings sagging in the sun, shadows short and sharp. Ellie walked the dusty trail into town with a basket on her hip and a string of hand-carved birds tucked safely beneath a cloth. Her shoulders were straight, but her steps were cautious, each one a quiet defiance. She wore a dress Marla Griggs had once tossed out behind the mercantile. It had been torn, stained with lye, and left to rot in the sun. Ellie had taken it, washed it with large soap, and mended it with long, invisible stitches. Now it hugged her frame neatly, simple and dignified. The people of Dry Creek saw her coming and fell silent. A man sweeping his porch leaned on his broom and stared. A mother gathered her children behind her skirt as if Ellie carried plague. Someone laughed, short and sharp like a snapped bone. She didn't flinch. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with flour dust and judgment. Marla stood behind the counter, arranging jars with exaggerated care. Her eyes lifted when Ellie entered, narrowing. "Well now," Marla said, her voice all sugar and sharp edges. "Back again, are you?" Ellie approached, set the carved birds down beside a small bundle of dried herbs, and unwrapped them slowly. 3 birds, each shaped with precision and love, wings slightly open, beaks lifted toward something unseen. Marla's mouth twitched. "You made these?" Ellie nodded. "They're sweet, I suppose," Marla said, "but they won't fill a pantry." Ellie held up her fingers, 1, 2, and then pointed to a spool of thread behind the counter. Her hands moved with intention, each motion weighted with meaning. Not everyone understood her signs, but she didn't need them to. She needed them to listen differently. Marla huffed, but handed over the thread. Outside, as Ellie turned to leave, she caught the whisper behind her. Poor thing, doesn't even know what she is. Living with him like that. Wild. Ellie paused, her hand tightening around the basket's handle. But she kept walking. Not because she didn't care. Because she couldn't afford to shatter. She passed the church, where Father Hale swept the front steps. He nodded gently, hand raised in peace. She smiled back, though it was a fragile thing. At the edge of town, a boy, barefoot, red-cheeked, threw a rock that landed just shy of her skirt. He giggled. Deaf girl can't even cry. The second rock hit her shoulder. She didn't turn. Not until she reached the shade of the old mesquite tree, where she sat down, carefully removed the birds from her basket, and dusted them one by one. Her dress was torn again now, but she brushed the dirt away slowly, as if claiming her own shape. Tahoma found her there before sundown. He didn't ask what happened. He simply sat beside her, silent as the earth. Her fingers moved, describing arcs in the dust, then shapes. A child. A stone. A heart. He watched, then took her hand and turned it palm up. A small bruise was already blooming. He wrapped it with a torn scrap of cotton from his saddlebag. She didn't look at him while he did it. She watched the desert horizon, where the light bent and shimmered like some unreachable place. That night, she cooked the beans. He built the fire. Neither spoke. But when she finished her meal, she stood, crossed the camp, and placed one of her carved birds on the stump beside his tools. A gift. He touched it only once, then left it where it sat. The next day, she dug a narrow trench beside the tent and planted seeds. No one had asked her to. The ground was dry, cruel, but she brought water every morning, poured it with care. Tahoma didn't stop her. He just watched. Sometimes he worked beside her, showing her how to shape arrows or grind roots into paste. Other times he disappeared into the hills, returning with game slung over one shoulder and new scratches down his arms. She always met him with a basin of water and a strip of cloth. They were becoming something. Not lovers. Not family. Something quieter. Truer. At night, she carved. One evening, Tahoma placed a small stringed instrument in her lap, a broken Apache fiddle, half-cracked but whole enough to sing. He strummed a few chords, the sound low and husky. She placed her hand against its body, felt the song travel through her skin. Her lips parted, not in sound but wonder. Then, slowly, she lifted the instrument and played one note, then another. Wrong at first, then closer, then smoother. The song was not heard in her ears, but she felt it in her chest. The next time she walked into town, she carried one of her birds to the chapel. Not to sell, not to trade. She placed it on the steps before dawn, where the preacher would find it. It was carved with care, and its wings were curved in flight. Father Hale kept it. Word spread. Some folks said she was soft in the head. Others said she was dangerous, an Apache bride with no words, only silence. A few said nothing, but began to watch her differently. Marla, for all her whispers, started setting aside scraps of fabric by accident. The flowers she planted began to rise, stubborn green stalks in a sea of dust. Tahoma noticed them first, then smiled just barely. Ellie caught the smile, and for the first time in her life, knew it was meant for her. That night, she carved a new bird, one wing lifted, one tucked, as if it were learning to fly, not yet soaring, but trying. She didn't give it to Tahoma. She set it beside the fire where they both could see, and that was enough. The smoke reached them first, thin, acrid, sharp as betrayal. It snaked low through the desert, riding the wind like a warning. Tahoma stood from the fire, his eyes narrowing toward the ridge. Ellie followed his gaze but saw nothing yet, only dust and heat shimmering like false water. He didn't speak. He never wasted words on what the wind already told. By noon, the mule grew restless, stamping and snorting as if some scent had stirred an old memory. Ellie touched its neck, murmuring with her hands and her eyes, calming it. Her own body stayed still, but her breath quickened. She felt the shift in the air. Then she saw him, a figure stumbling through the haze, hunched and uneven. He came like something rotted that wouldn't die. Hank Dawson, her father. The bottle dangled from his hand, sloshing. His face was red, jaw slack, one eye swollen from some recent misjudgment. He wore the same boots she remembered, the left one still missing a buckle, but now they kicked up dust in cruel rhythm. Ellie stepped back. Her body remembered things before her thoughts could catch them. The buckle bruises, the shouting that became fists, the way he always smiled before hurting her. Tahoma moved forward, quiet as a storm about to break. He didn't draw his blade. He didn't speak. "Where is she?" Hank barked, voice shredded with drink and rage. "You got no right." Tahoma said nothing. His presence alone made the air thinner. "I sold her, not gave her," Hank slurred. "And now this town's gone to hell, letting redskins steal girls and play husband with them." Ellie stood behind the mesquite tree, heart pounding like a war drum inside her ribs. She pressed her hand against its trunk to steady herself. "I'll take her back. She's mine." "She is not," Tahoma said, voice like gravel cooled by shadow. Hank raised the bottle, then smashed it against a rock. Glass scattered. Blood dripped from his hand, but he didn't seem to notice. From his coat, he pulled a small pistol, rusted but real. It trembled in his grip. "You think she wants you?" he spat. "You think she even knows what she is? She ain't right in the head. Always was a broken little whelp. Always silent. Never learned to scream." Ellie stepped forward. She wasn't sure when her feet had begun to move. She only knew that she wouldn't stand behind another tree. Not again. Tahoma reached to stop her, but she shook her head. Once. Firm. She stood in front of her father, between him and the camp. She looked him straight in the eye. Her fingers curled, and then began to speak. Not with sound. With shape. With clarity. "You do not own me." He stared, confused. She stepped closer, face flushed not with fear, but fury. "I see you. I remember. But I do not belong to a man who sold me like meat." Her signs came sharp. Measured. Her hands carved truth into the space between them. Hank's hand trembled. His mouth opened. "You don't even know what you're saying. You're just flapping fingers like a freak." She didn't flinch. Her final sign was slow, deliberate. "I am not yours to break." Then she turned her back on him. For a moment, time held its breath. The pistol rose, slow, uncertain. Tahoma stepped forward, voice low but lethal. "You lift that gun, and you won't lift another thing again." Sheriff Raleigh appeared then, riding hard from town. Dust billowed behind him like judgment catching up. He pulled up short, boots hitting the ground as he drew his own revolver. "Put it down, Hank." Hank blinked. "She's mine. I'm Takin, what's mine?" "That girl is not property," Raleigh said, tone clipped, eyes flicking toward Ellie. "Not anymore. Not ever." For once, the badge did its job. Hank looked at Ellie one last time. But she wasn't the girl he remembered. She was taller now, even if only by spirit, and her silence had never meant weakness. Just patience. He dropped the pistol. It clattered against the stones, useless. The sheriff cuffed him, muttering about drunkenness, about boundaries crossed, and town laws being tested. Hank stumbled as he was led away, blood trailing in the dirt. When the sound of hooves faded, the wind returned cooler now, as if relieved. Tahoma turned to Ellie. She was still watching the spot where her father had stood. Not crying, not trembling, just breathing. He reached out and touched her elbow gently. Her eyes flicked to his. No sign this time. No gesture. Just a long, steady look that said thank you without lips or hands. That evening, she carved again. Not a bird this time. A woman standing tall, one arm raised like a banner, the other hand clenched in strength. She placed it by the fire. Tahoma didn't touch it. He simply nodded and handed her a bowl of beans, warm and fragrant. The stars came out early that night, brave and bright. And somewhere in the camp, far from law and noise and men who mistook silence for surrender, a girl began to sleep without flinching. The desert had a way of remembering things. Old hoofprints still baked into the clay. Scars from wagon wheels worn smooth by wind. And now, where once the earth cracked like sorrow, pale blossoms unfurled beneath a silent dawn. Ellie knelt beside them, her hands brushing the small petals as if afraid to bruise their courage. Flowers in Dry Creek weren't common. Most folk believed the land too cruel to bloom. But she believed anyway. Poured water each day from the same dented tin, whispered to the soil with callous palms, waited under sun that burned and wind that scolded. And now they bloomed. Behind her, Tahoma moved with quiet rhythm, splitting wood, boiling water, feeding Dusty the mule. He'd said little since Hank was taken away, in shackles 2 days past. But something in him had shifted. He no longer looked at Ellie like she might vanish if he blinked. He looked at her now the way a man watches dawn arrive after a long night, cautious, reverent, a little stunned it finally came. She stood and approached him with a folded cloth in her hand. Inside, the carved figure of a woman she'd finished that morning. It was smoother now, refined. One arm lifted, not in defense, but in offering. Her eyes had depth, lips curved not in joy, but understanding. A self-made whole. Tahoma took the carving and studied it without speaking. His fingers traced the grooves. Then slowly he reached into the pouch tied to his belt and drew out something she hadn't seen since the day she was bought, the turquoise bead. It shone against his skin, small and soft and shaped by time. He lifted it on a leather cord, then gently tied it around her wrist. Her throat tightened. No words were needed. The townspeople, for a time, kept their distance. Hank Dawson's final tantrum had unsettled the balance. Sheriff Raleigh didn't press charges, but made it clear the land beyond town now belonged to the Apache and the girl, as if drawing a line for them to exist within. But something had changed. Marla Griggs left a bundle of fabric near the trailhead without a word. Father Hale walked out to the camp and asked if Ellie might carve something for the chapel. A dove, maybe, or a cross. She said yes with her hands and a smile. Her presence in town was no longer met with jeers, but nods. Curious glances. One child even approached her with a stone in his palm, asking if she could make it into something. She took it and returned a carved coyote 2 days later. He gave her a flower in return. Small kindnesses bloomed faster than petals. One evening, the wind shifted west, cool and steady. Tahoma motioned to her, a gentle tug of his chin, and together they walked past the camp, through dry canyons where owls roost and coyotes watched from the brush. The path wound higher, until they reached a rise that opened to the wide plain. The moon was just lifting, huge, golden, round as a whispered promise. Below them, Dry Creek shimmered in silver light. Even the harsh buildings seemed softened by distance, forgiven by dusk. Ellie sat, legs tucked beneath her. Tahoma lowered himself beside her, the silence between them full and unafraid. After a long while, he lifted his hand and began to hum again, soft, low, like water over stone. She leaned toward the sound, then reached for him. Her palm found his chest, just as it had weeks ago, and again she felt it, the music inside him. Only this time, she placed his hand over her heart. And he heard something too. She didn't pull away. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small bundle she hadn't seen before. Inside was a strip of white doeskin wrapped tight around something. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a carved ring of dark wood, oak, polished smooth, engraved with a feather and a seed. He held it between them, not offering it like a demand, but revealing it like a prayer. She looked at it, then him. Her hands moved, slow, tender, full of grace. Yes, he slipped it on her finger. Not as a husband marking a bride, but as a man giving a truth to another soul and trusting her to keep it. They stayed there long after the moon climbed high. And when they returned to camp, hand in hand, the desert wind greeted them like kin. By sunrise, the flowers she had planted were in full bloom, small, defiant, radiant against the red earth. And beside them stood a new carving, 2 birds side by side, wings not open, not flying, but touching. In the days to follow, Ellie carved a dove for the chapel, a set of stars for the schoolhouse, and a new totem for the edge of town, a woman with her palm raised, carved from mesquite wood, standing taller than any fear. No one touched it, but everyone saw. And in the evenings, when coyotes sang and the fire danced low, she and Tahoma sat close, sharing silence like a language that finally made sense. She still didn't speak. She didn't have to, because the man who bought her never owned her. He simply heard her, long before anyone else ever tried. And so if you find yourself walking where the land is cruel, where silence clings and shame grows like dust on skin, remember her. The girl no one wanted. The girl who never begged. The girl who heard the moon rise through the soles of her feet and bloomed, not because the world let her, but because she did it anyway.